Welcome to Saltier Politics. This week, our schedules have poured a mountain of salt all over our pod plans. So what we're doing is a best of pod and bringing back some great moments from one of our earlier interviews. The interview we're talking about this week was from November 2018 with Yale professor and author of How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley. Ilhan Omar actually tweeted about fascism in response to the Department of Homeland Security this week, asking for immigrants' social media information on applications to travel, saying, quote, "Make no mistake, this is fascism in action. There's no guarantee that the Trump administration won't weaponize immigrants' political views against them by denying entry." So let's talk about fascism. Without further ado, Jason Stanley.
Germany in 1938 was a country that was fairly new. It had not had the institutions that we have today in the United States. For example, obviously, they had been part of the Kaiser. It was not so long before that the Kaiser was forced to abdicate. Weimar Germany was a transitionary period, and then the Nazis obviously came to power less than a decade before Kristallnacht, and certainly before the start of World War I. So they didn't really have the institutions that the United States has. And don't you think that we potentially, or maybe you don't think, that we as a country have institutions that could survive those same nationalistic tendencies that Germany was not able to survive back in the 1930s?
Well, we're a country that only very recently emerged from a situation in which the hated outgroup, Black Americans, was not able to vote in large parts of the country when there were laws prohibiting the intermarriage between blacks and whites, members of the outgroup and members of the in-group. Very recently, up until the 1960s, these were the very same laws upon which the Nuremberg laws were based. So it's always the case, fascism is a politics of purity. There's fear about intermixing between the out-group and the in-group. And the Nuremberg laws illegalized relations between Jews and Germans, and they're based on laws that lasted until the 1960s in the United States. We, after the Civil Rights Movement, which arguably produced, the first moments of real democracy in the United States, where one group was not systematically excluded, we went right into a period of mass incarceration where, in the early 1970s, there were fewer than 300,000 people in prisons and jails. And now there are around 2.5 million, between 2.2 and 2.5 million. So that's by any measure, an enormous increase, much less the millions and millions more on probation, which is effectively a sentence that excludes you from society. So we have an enormous surveillance state. We have an enormous criminal apparatus. 1/4 of all the prisoners in the world are incarcerated in the United States. And it's largely directed against our black population. 9% of the world's prison population is black American. It comes from the tiny group of people of black Americans, 38 million black Americans. 9% of the world's prisoners are black American. To my knowledge, I think the only time in the world that's been replicated where such a small group constituted such a large group of the world's prison population was the Holocaust. You see incredible susceptibility towards lack of empathy towards outgroups.
And Jason, I'd kind of like to hop onto that because in your book you talk about the terrible tropes and outgroups being labeled, in that right now with how a lot of times how fascists discredit individual freedom. And you gave the Colin about Colin Kaepernick, about he's showing and exercising freedom, but how the president is currently discrediting that. It all kind of made sense to me when I read your book. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. So in fascism, things you invert things. So freedom means freedom only for the members of the chosen nation. So Kaepernick, by exercising freedom, since he's not a white American, is represented, because he's not a white American, is represented as, in fact, challenging freedom, challenging the flag. bowing down to the flag, to a symbol of nationalism, to a symbol of the nation, is taken to be emblematic of freedom, when in fact it's part of American history, it's part of our values to allow for protest. Freedom is the freedom to engage in protest. And of course, Colin Kaepernick is not protesting the flag at all. He's protesting the mistreatment of Black American citizens, and it has nothing to do with the flag. But his exercise of freedom, because he's a member of a minority group, is misrepresented as somehow a challenge to our values. So it's kind of like states' rights. States' rights were, in the first instance, states' rights were all about like the liberty of states to do what they want. But what was that liberty? That liberty was originally the liberty to enslave.
You know, one of the themes that you touch on in your book, which has been driving me absolutely insane for a good, probably going back to the time that Sarah Palin was on the ballot, although I'm sure it probably predates that, is this notion of anti-intellectualism. And it really reached an absurd point for me in 2012, when Mitt Romney ran against Barack Obama, both Harvard graduates, and Romney criticized Obama for being a Harvard graduate. When I think back in the day, people aspired to send their kids to good schools. You are a professor at Yale, so I know you probably would agree with me that that's quite an accomplishment. But this notion of anti-intellectualism, where people point to these East Coast elites, and a lot of times what they're talking about are not the rich people sitting in their penthouse on Park Avenue, but what they're talking about are academics, as this bastion of liberalism and this bastion of indoctrination of children or young adults into liberalism. That strikes me as something that is a predicate for a society that doesn't want to self-examine. And you talk about that as something that's really a predicate for fascism. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. So that's intellectually, fascism promotes anti-intellectualism. The idea fascism is all about power and loyalty and fear of the other. And you find fascist intellectuals sort of promoting a kind of irrationalism. And the idea is that the enemy of fascism is truth and reason. Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about how good propaganda should always be aimed at the least educated members of the population. Steve Bannon, and I'm not comparing Steve Bannon to Hitler, I'm just saying that in terms of his policies, but I'm saying that the propaganda, the rhetoric, the ideology strongly overlaps. Steve Bannon said, we got people to the polls on fear, on rage and fear. It was build the wall and lock her up that got people to the polls. And you find Hitler urging the same political maneuvers in Mein Kampf. He says you need to channel fear, you need to overwhelm rationality. Now, the thing so in fascism, you have one dominant group setting the stage, and the one dominant group's perspective is imposed upon the society as the only legitimate perspective. And but in fact, history is more complex than that. At any point in time in history, there are multiple groups, and the multiple groups each have a different experience of the same time. And so what you do in a university is, universities are guided by the truth. So you're guided by the fact that one point in history, each point in history is much more complex than just the view from the dominant perspective.
But I'm going to just stop you right there and just say this to you. I spent a long time at Fox News, which I'm sure, as you can understand, as an ideology, doesn't necessarily agree with what you're saying. They would say, and I think a lot of people might agree, that universities are not looking for truth, that they would say that universities are espousing a particular truth that they consider to be truth, but others consider to be the antithesis of the truth, and that the Ivy Leagues and other elite universities are indoctrinating young people into a certain set of liberal beliefs. And so I think if you were debating somebody at Fox or somebody who's of a conservative bent, they might say to you that, in fact, no, that what you're doing is not espousing the truth as a university professor or as an intellectual. What you're espousing is a particular liberal belief.
Right. So a couple of points here. First, a local point about the United States right now and my university. Yale University produced 3 politicians who ran for governor: Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Rod DeSantis in Florida, and Chris Kobach in Kansas. Went to Yale Law School. Abrams and Kobach went to Yale Law School. DeSantis went to Yale as an undergraduate. I don't think you can look at those 3 and say there's one uniform ideology that unites them. And similarly, as you earlier pointed out, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama, George Bush, these are all Yale or Harvard graduates with very different ideologies. So the reality belies that. But more generally, the attacks that Fox News levels are exactly the attacks you find all around the world in authoritarian governments. They're authoritarian attacks in universities because universities challenge ideas. Universities are the places where many perspectives are considered and challenged and debated, and that's a tremendous threat. So we just had, for example, in Hungary, Viktor Orban close down, make illegal the teaching of gender studies. Central European University was just closed down in Hungary. That's the best university in Hungary for spreading liberalism. European University in St. Petersburg in Russia closed down for gender studies, for teaching gender studies.
Isn't that because that's a threat to the patriarchal order that you talked about? That's the basis of fascism?
Yes. So you pick a favored perspective. So we talked earlier about how history involves multiple perspectives. Well, the perspective to have an area of the university that studies how women experience history is a grave threat to fascist ideology.
Well, I thought what was really interesting is, and I think it kind of ties into this, is about how fascists define who was really raped and the idea of victimhood and kind of recasting women and a lot of times liberals as ones who can't be raped. For example, Trump saying the women protesting were paid by Soros when really they were protesting sexual assault violence. I think the victimhood thing is interesting.
And you talk about that as well in your book, and you're saying victimhood is a key cornerstone of this mentality.
So this is a very common phenomenon. Let me give a drastic instance of it. Consider what happened to the Rohingya people in Myanmar. In 2012, 3 Rohingya men raped a Rakhine woman. In response, the entire Rohingya population was consigned to about 200 villages from which they were prevented from leaving in the evening. Of course, they lost their livelihoods and their jobs. And as the years progressed, this harsh rhetoric against the Rohingya are rapists, they're criminals, they're lazy, they live off the state, began to increase even more, although it was always a part of that rhetoric. There was that rhetoric directed against the Rohingya was always there. It just became much more intense. And of course, the fact that the Rohingya were living off the state was due to the fact that they were consigned to these 200 villages. So eventually in 2017, the rhetoric became reality, and the Rohingya were viciously attacked, and Rohingya women were mass raped. But no one speaks of the non-Rohingya population as rapists, even though what the Rohingya women encountered was absolute horror, the mass rape of ethnic cleansing.
Well, since you bring up the Rohingyas, it's interesting because Aung San Suu Kyi, who's now nominally, I guess, in charge of Myanmar or Burma, although the military junta is still in charge, was herself a victim and herself oppressed by this junta, and is, from what I can tell, doing really nothing to help out the Rohingya. So that, I guess, that's par for the course, right? That sometimes the oppressed becomes the oppressor in many ways.
Because victimhood, the feeling of victimhood, this is why in fascist politics you make your supporters feel like victims, because victimhood masks reality. So, victimhood creates this outrage. Like if you think of the Serbian nationalism, it was entirely based on a grievous sense of victimhood. And of course, the Serbians were victimized in World War II, for instance. But victimhood can mask your own terrible actions. So Similarly, in Germany, the mistreatment of the Germans in Versailles was, of course, this huge theme in Hitler's politics, as was the supposed mistreatment of ethnic German populations abroad. So you constantly, if you want to urge a population to be inhumane towards others, you convince them that they are victims. Now, of course, sometimes some populations are victims. We're genuinely oppressed, and it's important that they recognize that. But what's frightening is when the dominant group is sort of blinded by this by victimhood.
And would you say that's going on here, Jason? Would you say that what's happening here is that you've got, especially among certain segments of our population, you've got, and this is by no means applicable to all white voters, but you've got a segment of white voters who feel like they're being oppressed, they're being kept down. People of color are getting all the benefits, whether it's admissions into colleges or other social benefits, and that they feel like they're losing their hold and their grip, and they're being reverse discriminated against, and that's making them feel like a victim, despite the fact that, frankly, it is I think, much better to be a white man in this country than it is to be anything else from a purely statistical point of view.
Absolutely. And Trump, of course, his politics involves hitting that again and again, not just with whiteness, but with Christianity. You can say Christmas again, as if there was ever a time in this country where you couldn't say Christmas, Merry Christmas. Many of Trump's supporters aim their ire not at the wealthy elites whose children fill elite schools with legacy admissions, but rather with long oppressed or hated minority groups. So yeah, you aim the anger not at its appropriate target, which one might think would be the people whose policies led to loss of jobs, for instance, or the bankers whose policies led to the financial crisis. But you aim it against minority groups, and you make people think that increased equality for women, for non-whites, is taking things away from them. And you do it by creating a zero-sum game. You say, there's only a small pie, there's a pie, and any slice given to anyone else is less for you. When in fact, with immigration, it doesn't work like that. It's not like immigrants come and take a slice and so you don't get that slice. Immigrants come and they have children and who enter the workforce and pay taxes and expand the economy.
I have, on that point, a question. So I recently went for work to cover the Young Black Leadership Summit in D.C., which was a group of Black Republicans listening to Trump. And one of their points was that political orthodoxy of the Democrats has kept them down, and Dems want to keep Black people down with welfare.
I'm a strong advocate of multi-party democracy. My loyalty is to multi-party democracy. So I think we need Republican ideas, we need Democratic ideas. I see both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as large tents with inconsistent ideas in them. So I'm glad that there is a substantial number of Black Republican voters. That said, I think statistically, if you look at the socioeconomic situation, it's just defying reality to blame Black Americans for the fact that there's a 20-to-1 wealth gap. I mean, the average Black child is born into a family with $5,000 of wealth, whereas the average white child is born into a family with over $120,000 of wealth. So it's hard for me to see, given that we're talking about children, that we're talking about fault. And those are the results of long-term structural barriers to Black wealth. And so then you look at other statistical facts, the fact that Black men, as Diva Pager, the recently tragically deceased Harvard sociologist, showed in her dissertation, that Black men seeking jobs without a criminal record get fewer callbacks than white men with a criminal record. So there's all sorts of statistical evidence. There's huge disparities in wealth between black Americans and white Americans from birth. And so, given that, it's hard for me to blame a child born into a family with 1/20th the wealth of another family. It's hard for me to see it as that child's fault.
Jason, I learned something interesting about you, and just for full disclosure, you and I have known each other for 20 years more probably. You were the thesis advisor to my best friend at Cornell when you were teaching there, and the scary thing about you is I think you were probably 25 when you were her thesis advisor.
I wasn't her thesis advisor.
You weren't? Oh, okay, well, no. you were her professor, I guess. And she was an undergrad, and I think she was probably 3 or 4 years younger than you at the time. But the one thing I never knew about you is you told me today you went to a bunch of different schools, and one of the schools you went to, colleges I should say, was in Germany. You moved there when you were 17. You started college when you were 16. And you moved to Tübingen University in Germany to study philosophy, which is pretty amazing. But you made a living while doing that by cleaning the bus depot there, right?
Yes. Indeed. In the mornings, I would get up at like 7 in the morning and head to the Tübingen bus depot to clean the underside of buses with a steam gun until about 11 a.m. And then I would clean up and head in around noon to the university to my Hegel's Logic seminar.
In German? In
German.
That's pretty amazing. The other thing that I think is hilarious, so on this show, we play a game with all our guests called Two Truths and a Lie. And everybody else that I asked to do this, to come up with 2 truths and a lie, had absolutely no problem doing that because apparently they're all accomplished liars. But you, who studied Immanuel Kant, take truths very literally. And therefore, you had a problem figuring out exactly what I meant by lying, because according to Kant, if I remember from my philosophy classes back in college, you really shouldn't lie even if the Nazis are coming to get you and you're locked in a closet, right? So I think you had a difficult time struggling with the 2 truths and a lie. Have you thought about what those are? You want to share those with us? We'll try to guess.
I finally did.
Okay, give it to us, and we'll try to figure out how bad of a liar you are.
Okay, so my father's dissertation is on my wife's tribe.
On your wife's tribe. Okay, your wife is from where in Africa? I know she's from Africa. Which country?
Kenya.
Kenya, okay.
So she's half African American and half from Kenya.
Okay.
I can't swim, and my children agree that I'm a cool daddy.
Wow. I'm going to say it's B. I'm going to say it's. I think your children would agree that you're cool, because I know you do an awesome dad dance. You told me. I am going to say that your dad wrote the dissertation on your wife's tribe, and I'm going to say it is a lie that you can't swim.
I would have to agree.
No, my children do not agree that I'm a cool
What?
daddy. Isn't that shocking?
It is shocking. I know you. You are cool. Your kids are absolutely wrong.
Wait, how old are they?
7 and 3. Whenever we go into New York City, they're like really nervous.
Because they don't think you're cool enough to protect them?
I don't think I'm cool enough to be in New York City.
Oh.
Is there anything particular that you do? Do you wear dad jeans or that they particularly pick on?
No, I break out in my cool daddy dance.
And they don't think that's that cool?
Oh, that'll do it.
Yeah. I got to agree with your kids. If you're breaking out in a cool daddy dance in front of them, that's not cool.
Yeah, that's not cool.
I got to go. I got to side with your kids on that one. My 6-year-old, of course, thinks I'm uber cool, and that's purely because I never do anything to embarrass him. So I basically
is clever.
I basically keep my mouth shut and don't try to dance around his kids, around his friends. I kind of keep a low profile and just feed them chocolate so they'll think I'm cool. I basically bribe them into thinking that.
I need to adopt that policy.
I know. Just go along with whatever they want, and they will absolutely think you're cool. My 6-year-old thinks Emily is super cool because she brings him stuff all the time, but he refuses to write her thank you notes, which is a whole separate problem.
I lecture my kids on fascism.
I'm sure they're really well adjusted there in the 2nd grade.
Wait, have any of them pulled out just an argument that you have told them against you and just kind of surprised you and just said, Dad, that's a mythic argument?
Or some Hegel dialectics or anything?
My older son pulls out democratic political theory on a constant basis whenever I become authoritarian.
Really?
No, Daddy, you're not supposed to be authoritarian. It's a democracy, and in a democracy, everyone rules.
Doesn't he know that in every house, it's really not a democracy, it is a complete dictatorship of the parents?
Well, you can comment on that. Unfortunately, I made the terrible mistake of, from a very early age, urging democracy. I'm a deep believer in liberal democracy, so I always told him, everyone rules, we all rule together, we all make every decision together. And then by the time I figured out that that was the wrong advice to tell a 3-year-old, it was too late.
You're so screwed. That's it. You got to start from scratch. You got to have a third one purely to raise them in a completely autocratic society and let the others kind of not influence that person.
I look forward to the day when you're at the table and telling one of your kids that they can't do something, and they just pull up your book and it just says how fascism works. At what point when did you start writing this book?
So I first started switching. I was working in very technical areas of philosophy for many years. And in 2009, I taught a summer course at Central European University in Budapest. And it was a wonderful summer, and Hungary was a thriving liberal democracy, and everyone was talking about their newfound freedoms and hanging out in rooftop bars, and it was wonderful. It felt like New York City in its glory years. And then I returned in 2010, and Viktor Orban had won, and there was a sort of somberness over the city. And I walked past a placard, and Saint Stephen, the patron saint of Hungary, was standing with holding a menorah. And I said, what does that say? And somebody read it to me, and they said, it said, Hungary will not become another Palestine.
Oh.
And so I realized quickly that you can be living in what you regard as a thriving liberal democracy, and especially if you're living in the cities, when so much of the anti-democratic elements, the anti-democratic ethos, might be masked for you, the resentment against the cities, the resentment of the freedoms that cities can sometimes represent. When that's masked from you, then you might not see how quickly things go. And Hungary was a wake-up call for me. And when I thought about Hungary, when I thought that of the casual anti-Roma sentiment I would hear on the streets, and I was like, oh yeah, of course, that should have tipped me off. So that was a warning for me. And then when I came back to the United States, like the first article I wrote in the press was about birtherism in 2011. Because as soon as I heard birtherism and I saw what was happening, it terrified me. Because knowing the past and knowing the structure of conspiracy theories, if you're going to target the media, here's how you target the media. Here's how the Protocols of the Elders of Zion worked. They said, the media is not reporting that the media is controlled by Jews, and that shows that the media is controlled by Jews. So it's this kind of trap you set for the media. Like, if the media doesn't report on the wacky conspiracy theory, then the media is part of the wacky conspiracy theory. And birtherism worked exactly like that. Mr. Trump then went on Fox News and said, CNN is controlled by Obama. You can tell because they're not reporting on the fact that Obama was born in Kenya. So once you see conspiracy theories starting to take root and starting to take hold and dominating the thought, then you're starting to see attacks on the media. So all the signs we see, the attacks on the university as dens of liberalism, these are very familiar historical tropes.
Right.
So,
and then it sets up the unreality, like you talked about, how conspiracy theories and fake news replace reasoned debate.
Absolutely. And conspiracy theories function strangely. Their goal is to undermine the credibility of the person they're aimed against. They're sometimes so wacky, like say take Pizzagate, sometimes just so implausibly wacky that you're not even supposed to really believe it. It's just supposed to impugn their target. The target is beyond the pale.
But isn't that, Jason, isn't that typical of what we've seen? We've seen quote after quote from supporters of the president saying, yeah, I get that he lies, but it doesn't matter because he's standing up for me. And I don't really care. And I don't really care if he's lying because he stands up for me. So then truth doesn't become something that's relevant, even if you know he's not telling the truth. For example, there is virtually nobody on the planet who believes that the president did not engage in a relationship with Stormy Daniels, including his supporters. They just don't care. and they see they see him as saying that he did and is sticking it to the man. They think it's funny that he's lying and he's sticking it to the man. And so to me, it's fascinating because it is a team. I talked about this on our podcast last week. There is a sense that there's a team jersey mentality where if somebody's wearing an R or a D on their jersey, that you're going to support whatever they do, regardless of what their behavior is like. Not for everybody, but for a lot of partisans. And so to me, this is just the most extreme manifestation of that, isn't that?
That's right. That's how you break down democracy. You create a situation. Bannon in the Errol Morris democracy documentary says, our goal is to make politics a life or death struggle. And when politics is a life or death struggle, when it's about personal destruction, then you don't care about what's true and what's false. It's just our side versus their side. You'll use any weapon to win. And when you transform politics like that, you lose your democratic culture. You lose your democratic culture because the other side are not fellow citizens. They're your enemy. And so the struggle for all of us as this sort of politics advances is to not lose facts, not lose glimpse of the fact that we are all citizens of the same country together, despite our political differences. That's the main barrier.
That's a very positive note to end on an otherwise fairly depressing topic. Jason, I cannot thank you enough for your time. Emily and I both can't thank you enough. And I urge everybody here to read Jason's book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. It is a short book, but it is, I think, an incredibly impactful book and one of the most insightful books I think I've read in a very long time. And I couldn't put it down. Emily, I think you felt the same. And
you can't watch the news the same again.
Yeah, you will never watch the news the same way again. And it's once frightening and enlightening, and I think a very good guide to how we can turn things around for this country going forward. Jason Stanley, thanks so much for joining us.